This is going to be a bit of a themed reading vlog, but it's specifically to work on my TBR that needs to be brought down. Sometimes I'm a massive mood reader and sometimes I really love to just set myself a little challenge. I still mood read within those challenges, but I am hoping before the end of 2025 that I'm going to be reading 4 books from 10 years ago, and they're all books that have been nominated or won prizes in 2015. 2015 for me was quite a momentous year. It's the year I got married, it's the year I adopted my lovely dog Mia, although we have since lost her, but 2015 was such a big year for me, so it's quite nice to go back and read the sorts of books that were coming out then, and the books that were being recognised for prizes. Later in the video I'll tell you about some of the other options that I had to pick from as well, but these are the ones that I've committed to reading. So first of all we have The Bees by Laline Paull. This one is a bit of a dystopia. It was nominated for the Women's Prize for Fiction in that year, and we are reading the book from the point of view of a bee who is within her hive, and things are going to happen. The second book I have is The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. This one was nominated for the fantasy category for the Goodreads Choice Awards in 2015, and the following year winner of the Hugo Award 2016. So not the year I'm talking about. Awards are usually based on different timescales, so winning the award, whether it was in 2015 or 2016, depends on what day within the year it was published. So for the Goodreads Choice Awards, this was in that category. For 2015. It's technically the end of the world. It says at the very beginning that this is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends for the last time. So I'm quite excited to start this one and see how I find something like this. I don't read too much fantasy, is what I mean. The next book I've got is Grief is a Thing with Feathers by Max Porter. This one was nominated for the Goldsmiths Prize in 2015. This is a short one, but it is poetry, and I have heard quite a tough read, but I'm still looking forward to reading it. And then the final one that I have is A Little Life, This Little Life, A Little Life by Hanya Yanigahara. So this one actually came up across so many categories. I believe for the Women's Prize it was actually nominated in 2016, again because of the different prize years, but it was also part of the Goodreads Choice Awards, and it was part of, I think it was nominated for the Booker as well. So it spans the awards that I'm looking at. But I have started that one as well, and actually so far really enjoying it. I think because it's such a mammoth book, I'm only 3% of the way into that one, but the writing style I'm really enjoying so far, so I'm quite intrigued to see how that one goes. And I've been putting it off for so long. This is another one where I was influenced by people on BookTube to buy the book, but after reading The Department of Speculation by Jenny Offill, which is, you know, something quite awful happens to the woman in it. She's very depressed. It's very emotional, and yet I didn't feel that emotional myself. I think it's a very powerful book, possibly the best book I've read this year so far, but I didn't feel emotionally devastated by it, and I'm in the mood to feel emotionally devastated, and I have heard that A Little Life does that. So I want to see if it does that to me. In terms of like physical emotional responses to books, I don't often get that tearful or anything. What I tend to find is in books like Sealed by Naomi Booth, Mary and the Rabbit Dream, and Misery, the body horror style books. I have talked about these in my Ed Gein recommendations video. But in those books, I feel tense. I can feel my body tensing up, but I don't tend to have sort of emotional responses. I can't remember the last time I actually cried at a book, so it'll be interesting to see if this one does that to me. Let's crack on. I have finished The Bees by Laline Paull. What an interesting read. So I think this is if you took The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood and you set that within a beehive, a bee colony. And I think that's a pretty accurate sort of reflection of what this book is. Do I think that's a successful thing to do? Setting a dystopia like that inside of the animal kingdom and having the protagonist be an animal and us having to empathise with and see ourselves as an animal. I think it's quite successful. I do think it holds you at a slight distance from the story. I never felt fully engaged. There were some quite emotional scenes around motherhood in this, which I don't think hurt the way that they should do. I don't think they made me feel the way that they should do. Things to do with motherhood will always get me. As a mum, I can't help it. It's just when there's anything to do with hurting children, children dying, it breaks me. But this, I didn't feel quite so emotionally engaged, and I wonder if that's because I'm that one step removed from it. However, what that enabled the author to do by having it within this bee colony is to have something like The Handmaid's Tale, which looked at patriarchal versus matriarchal societies, the role of religion within society, the role of a monarchy within society and who controls the monarchy. But it also enabled us to think about climate change and what's happening to these animals who rely so heavily on natural plants and unfertilized plants, unchemically enhanced plants that are not damaged by pollution. So it certainly did a lot of interesting things, but I just never felt that emotionally engaged. I read the whole thing, I read it quite quickly. This is one of the ones where I've used that Libby app now to get through some of my books. So I listened to this mostly on audio, and then I read the last sort of 70 pages physically, but there was just something that held me at a distance. What would I rate this? If I had the nuance of decimal places, I'd say like a 3.75 out of 5, which I'd round up to 4 for Goodreads. That book was on the 2015 Women's Prize for Fiction, and in that year we also had The Offering by Grace McLean, not heard of that. The Life of a Banana by P.P. Wong, not heard of that. The Shore by Sarah Taylor, not heard of that. The Walk Home by Rachel Seyfer. Now I have a Rachel Seyfer on my shelves. I have The Dark Room, what year was that from? Was that 2009 maybe? The Table of Less Valued Nights by Marie Phillips. I've not heard of that. Ice Cream Star, or The Country of Ice Cream Star by Sarah Newman, not heard of that. Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. I do want to read that one. I don't own it. Elizabeth is Missing. I've read that. I loved that. I'd really like to reread that. Emma Healy does some really interesting fiction, and I really want to read quite a few of her novels actually. Dear Thief by Samantha Harvey. I've heard of Samantha Harvey, but I don't think I've heard of that book. I Am China by Zhaolu Guo. That sounds good. The Girl Who Was Saturday Night by Heather O'Neill. Not heard of that. Crooked Heart by Lisa Evans. I don't own that one, but I do own another Lisa Evans, which I'll put on the screen. Not read any of her work before. Aren't We Sisters by Patricia Ferguson. Not heard of that. Rachel Cusk Outline. Heard of that. I don't know whether I'd be interested in her writing or not. I keep seeing it and thinking I might be, but I don't know. Sarah Waters, The Paying Guest. I don't have that one, but I have... Which one do I have? The Little Stranger to read of Sarah Waters, so I want to read that one. Anne Tyler of Spool of Blue Thread. I have heard of that, want to read it, don't own it. Camilla Shamsi, A God in Every Stone. I've not read that one, but I read Home Fires by Camilla Shamsi. That was great. Ali Smith, How to Be Both. I read this. I DNF'd it about 70% of the way through. I just couldn't get on with it. And then before, Gemma Way, not heard of that either. So I've not heard of many of these, but that is the 2015 Women's Prize list. So that's the first book done. Hello. Okay, I'm actually here to talk to you about 2 books. So, the next book in this list is The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. Fantasy is not really my genre, so this has sat on my shelf because I'm always a bit nervous about starting it because I find them quite difficult to get into. However, having said that, some of the fantasies that I've read have been the best books that I've ever read, so things like Mordew by Alex Phoebe, one of the best fantasies, one of the best books I've ever read. I'm really currently enjoying The Northern Lights with my kids, although that's a bit of a complicated relationship I have with that. You know, some of these are really surprising to me that I actually like them so much. I thought I would enjoy this, but I was really nervous about picking it up because I find them difficult to get into because it's not my genre. It doesn't come naturally to me. My word, was this amazing. I cannot believe how much I loved this book. I was really in the mood for a book that would absolutely crush me, that would make me feel all the emotions. This has done it. I unfortunately was reading one of the concluding scenes, not quite the concluding scene, but one of the end scenes, and I was stood at the bus stop waiting for the bus back from university and trying not to cry in public. Like, I was fully gone. This is just everything. And as I was going through the chapters, so many chapters surprised me. There is a twist that comes in 2 parts. It's a twist that happens in 2 parts. If you've read it, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. The first part, I predicted. I could see that coming. Not that it made it any less powerful, but I saw that coming. But for some reason, despite the fact that the second twist was the natural conclusion, sort of a natural progression from that first twist, I didn't see that coming at all. And so that just absolutely shocked me. But yes, as I was reading this, I would read different chapters and I'd be like, I was not expecting it to do this to me. I was not expecting to feel the way this is making me feel. I was just not expecting this. It took me, you know, the first couple of chapters to really get into the flow of it. But after that, I couldn't put it down. I just wanted to read this all the time. Definitely 5 stars. I don't really know how to describe the plot to you because I'm just not used to talking about fantasy books. We have something that is resembling Earth in the future. Everyone is concentrated on the ground. So we're following characters who have an ability to affect rock and the planet. So they can do things like quell earthquakes and resolve volcanoes, or cause them, but they're mostly being used by normal people, by average humans, to stop those things. But in general, there is an attitude of fear, and we are following 3 individuals in this who all have that ability that is called orogeny. The 5th season refers to a period in history, and there are multiple periods. These are seasons that occur regularly, semi-regularly, in which something dreadful happens and it might wipe out most of humanity. It might do something like that. It might only last a couple of months and people can survive it, or it might last 100 years and most of the population will die out. That's what the 5th season refers to, and that is happening in this book. The beginning of a new season is happening, but the way the book even starts is, but this is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends for the last time. So we're building up to something pretty momentous even from the opening words. Yeah, I really don't know how else to describe this other than absolutely magnificent, even for someone who is not a fantasy reader. So let me go through Goodreads, because there are some other books on here that I have read or have not read. So going through, the winner of the mystery thriller category for 2015, The Girl on the Train by Paula Hawkins. I have read that. I really loved that at the time. I don't know whether it will stand up now. I was an average commuter at the time and I thought it was great at that moment. The Kindworth Killing by Peter Swanson. Again, I was your average commuter reading thrillers and discussing them in the office with the people I worked with, and I thought that was a really good book. I found it really engaging. Don't know whether it would stand up to my taste now. The Ice Twins by S.K. Tremaine. Both me and my mum have read this and loved this. But yeah, I thought that was another really good thriller. So You've Been Publicly Shamed by John Ronson. This is non-fiction and I thought it was really good, and he's going and interviewing people who have been publicly shamed. So people on social media, people who have posted something and then the internet has sort of taken it by storm and it's just absolutely obliterated their lives, and how people cope with this, how people have survived that or not survived it, as the case may be. I thought it was a really good non-fiction. Not really much else to say about it. On my shelves, I have The Argonauts by Maggie Nelson. I have not yet read that, so I can't really say much else. I have Vegan Reacher's Indian Kitchen, and I have used that cookbook, so that's just another one I have. A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. I have read that. I did not enjoy that. I really enjoyed the second book in that series and then hated the third book, so I do not recommend that series at all. Because what's the point in reading a series when you hate the first book and the third book and you only like the middle book? There's just no need. And then I also have on my list The Library of Souls, which is the third book in the Miss Peregrine's Peculiar Children series by Ransom Riggs. I've read the first 2 books, and so the third book that is on this is my next one to read, and maybe 2026 will be the year that I'll get read. Maybe. And then the final one that is on this list is The Wrath and the Dawn by Renee Adieh. And that is the next book I'm going to talk to you about, because I started to read this because it was available on the Libby app. I have to say, the Libby app is revolutionising my ability to get through my owned books. And it's also been one of the longest standing books on my Kindle that's been unread. So I decided to give it a go, try and get through it. Unfortunately, it is YA romantasy, and I very much recognise that I am not the target audience for that. I think when I very first came back to reading, I quite enjoyed some of that, and there are some sort of YA type romantasies that I have enjoyed. This was not one of them, and I think that's because my tastes have evolved since I purchased it. I DNF'd it at 50%. I gave it to the 50% mark, but I just did not feel like I was interested in the ways that the couple were talking to each other, that sort of really overly emotional, overly yearning, because I think yearning is a good thing, but overly yearning, overly teenage hormone driven way of interacting with each other, I just wasn't getting on with. So I decided that I didn't want to finish it. However, as I said, I recognise I'm not the target audience, and I also believe that it's brilliant if this is bringing, because people are talking about the fact that this is somewhat of a retelling of the 1001 Nights, which is classic Islamic literature. And I think that's brilliant that that is coming to new audiences, and the people who are reading it will go, oh, so this is based on classic literature from another part of the world. I also think the descriptions of food in it were brilliant. I mean, it made me want to eat those foods. And I don't normally care that much about descriptions of food in books, but it's bringing a cultural heritage, a cultural cuisine to new readers. And I think that's a brilliant thing that it's doing, but it's just not for me. So I won't be finishing that. Thanks. The next one that I'm reading is Grief is the Thing with Feathers by Max Porter. This is a blend of poetry and sort of a short story novella. Having just read and loved The Department of Speculation by Jenny Offhill, I'm quite looking forward to getting into this one. Okay, the next one finished is Grief is the Thing with Feathers by Max Porter. I read this one because it was nominated for the Goldsmiths Prize in 2015. I did have a browse through the list, but I haven't read anything else from 2015 specifically, so this is the only one I can talk about from that list. This is a blend of poetry and story, so we have a man whose wife has just died and he's trying to navigate his own grief whilst looking after their children, and that manifests with having a crow come to live with them, and he is communicating with this crow. He's writing about a crow and his favourite poet, Ted Hughes, and we sort of intersperse between the dad's voice, the crow's voice, and the boy's voice, and the boys are almost like a choral voice. You don't have one or the other. You might hear little snippets that are from one or the other, but it's within this sort of choral voice that is just the boys. I thought this was amazing. This made me cry. I can't believe it. I said in my last video I really wanted something that was going to pack an emotional punch, and I've had 2 books so far that have done that, and I'm reading one that is supposed to emotionally devastate me, although I'm skeptical about that. So whilst this I think is amazing, I do query how the crow sections are done, and I can see why this gets some amazing reviews and some not so great reviews. I'm sure if I was studying this for university, we would pick it apart and I would come to understand why the crow's voice is so important, why the things that are happening, the audio things that are happening, because there's a lot that happens to do with sound and the way that words sound in the crow sections. So I can see that those things are being done, but I'm not quite sure what they mean. I'm not quite sure what they're adding to the overall story. And I think that's a very difficult thing to do when you're writing something that's a story and a poem, is having both those things work so well. I think this story would work almost as well without the crow's presence at all. I think if you took all those sections out, you would still have a fantastic poetry story here. Now, I did want to share another poem that it really made me think of. It's Midterm Break by Jemisin. Got my little notebook where I write down all the poems that really called me. So I'll just read it to you. It's only a relatively short poem. I sat all morning in the college sickbay, counting bells, knelling, classes to a close. At 2 o'clock, our neighbours drove me home. In the porch, I met my father crying. He had always taken funerals in his stride, and Big Jim Evans saying it was a hard blow. The baby cooed and laughed and rocked the pram when I came in, and I was embarrassed by old men standing up to shake my hand and tell me they were sorry for my trouble. Whispers informed strangers I was the eldest, away at school as my mother held my hand in hers and coughed out angry, tearless sighs. At 10 o'clock, the ambulance arrived with the corpse, staunched and bandaged by the nurses. Next morning, I went up into the room. Snowdrops and candles soothed the bedside. I saw him for the first time in 6 weeks, paler now, wearing a poppy bruise on his left temple. He lay in the 4-foot box as in his cot. No gaudy scars, the bumper knocked him clear. A 4-foot box, a foot for every year. And I mean, when I read that final line, 4-foot box, a foot for every year, like it makes me feel the emotional punch every single time. And in this, the final page, the final scene in which the boys and their father are scattering their mother's ashes and screaming, I love you, I love you, I love you into the air. I even feel myself getting emotional now thinking about reading it. Again, like N.K. Jemisin, I was stood in public, I was sat in the cafe waiting for my class to start at university when I read those final pages, and my God, did they have me emotionally jerked. But yeah, so that is brilliant. I think I'm going to give it a 4 stars because, as I say, I'm not quite sure how I feel about the crow sections, but the overall thing was just absolutely amazing. That's another one done. The final one I'm reading for this is A Little Life, although funnily enough, this is the one I've been reading since the very beginning. I started this when I very first started this vlog, and I'm still only 46% of the way through. It is taking so long to get through, and I'm not quite sure how I feel about it. I might save that for the next clip though. And once I've finished it and I feel a bit more certain about what's going on, I mean, even at 46%, I've read 350 pages of this book. But yeah, anyway, see ya. Okay, I've read the final book for this little video. A Little Life for my little video. I am really torn about how I feel about it. Ultimately, this is not the book for me, but I can understand why people are calling it a modern classic, why people think this is going to be something that's going to be studied. I don't know whether to begin with the negative opinions or the positive opinions. So let me give you the basic premise first. We are following Jude. Jude St. Clair is our main character. We open up with 4 friends, but Jude is the main character. And we start with him at about age 20 when he's getting his first flat with his friend, Willem. And they have 2 other friends that they're doing college, university with, whatever it is in America. So there's the 4 of them, and we get in-depth character studies to start with on these 4 friends. But as we move through the story, it very much focuses on Jude. We start out by not actually even having Jude's own story. We focus on the other friends and how they interpret him. And then as the story unfolds, it becomes more centered on him. And we start to learn more about his past. And his past is where all his trauma has started. He's grown up in the care system. He was abandoned as a baby. And then he was unfortunately in a vulnerable situation, and more bad things happened to him, which have led to further bad things happening to him as an adult. And we sort of see him in this almost back and forth manner from almost birth to death. And that is the premise of this story. So plot-wise, it all centres around the life of a singular person, really, and how he's navigating his trauma. I have seen reviews of this that suggest that this is too much trauma for one person to experience, and unfortunately I don't agree with that. If you think that this is too much trauma, you've not met enough people who have had traumatic experiences in their life. People who grow up in vulnerable situations, whether that's because they're in the care system, whether it's because they have grown up in poverty, whether it's to do with race, because that is a big factor, their sexuality, whether it's because they have special needs. Children who grow up in a vulnerable situation can often fall into cycles of traumatic experiences. This is such a hard thing to talk about. Not only in youth does it really affect how your brain develops, how you see yourself, how you process those things that have happened to you, but as you become an adult, depending on what types of trauma you've experienced, it might affect your health, it might affect your relationships, it might affect how you portray yourself and therefore how you interact with other people and attract people who may continue those cycles of abuse with you. So no, I don't really think that this is an unrealistic portrayal of how traumas can manifest throughout somebody's life. I think it's quite realistic. What I think was an interesting choice is that Hanya Yanigahara decided that these would all of our 4 central characters become top of their field. They become very wealthy, they become famous movie stars, they're top of their law practice, they are famous artists, like they are all people with a lot of money. So these are people who can access good healthcare, they can access therapy if they need it, they have safe houses that they can live in, they can access food. Their trauma in later life does not relate to poverty. Whereas I think it would be more realistic if someone who had gone through what Jude had gone through ended up not being able to make a living, really struggling with life, not being able to access healthcare. I think that's actually more common. The way that you tend to see, I mean in the UK, I would also say in America, but I don't live there, people who have gone through these cycles of trauma end up really struggling to access the help that they need. They don't have a best friend who's a doctor. They don't have access to all this wealth. It's even more sad than what Hanya Yanigahara has put into this book. So, having said that, having said how realistic I feel this is, I don't think this is the book for me because this is really in-depth character studies. It's 720 pages of in-depth character studies. I prefer my character studies to be more concise. So things like Near Distance by Hannah Stoltenberg, that was fantastic, but that was about 200 pages. And I really felt I understood that person. 720 pages is a long slog. And it felt to me a bit like when I was reading Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, that there would be whole chapters, whole sections that felt almost irrelevant. And I could have enjoyed the story just as much without it. So in Victor Hugo, I don't know if you've read it. Do I have him here? Les Miserables. So I mean, this is even chunkier. But in this, he gives whole chapters to describing a field that was at some point in history a battlefield. That's clearly doing something in the story. I've never really read this in a critical way and really thought about what it's doing, but it's doing something. It's there for a reason, but I don't enjoy that. I skimmed those bits because I didn't really care. It wasn't part of the story for me. With A Little Life, you'd have all these tangents about different people's lives that felt irrelevant. But at the same time, I can see how what we're looking at here is how people's traumas communicate with each other. So obviously we have our central character with his massive trauma, but everyone around him, as you learn their backstories, you come to know that they all have trauma in some way or another, whether it relates to their race, whether it relates to having an unusual childhood. None of them measure up to Jude's trauma, but they all have it, and how their trauma has impacted them informs how they react to Jude's, what little they know of it. They know he's been through something, but they don't know what. So it's somewhat of how their traumas speak to each other, how they relate to each other through their traumas, overcoming them in some situations. So one of the characters whose own trauma led him to not asking questions, by the end of it was trying to ask questions and talk to Jude about what was going on. So I can see what it's doing there. I can see why it's building this massive, broad, sweeping picture, but that is not not for me. There were a few moments where I felt emotional in this, but it was mostly to do with Harold, who is the older man who decides to adopt Jude as an adult, and his kindness towards Jude. Those were the moments where I felt a bit emotional, but largely this didn't devastate me the way it's devastated other people. In this video, I would say the 5th season and Grief is the Thing with Feathers made me more emotionally vulnerable than A Little Life. And I think that's because the whole way through I was going, I'm not enjoying this, but I was like critically analysing it and really thinking about what it was doing. So I never really felt too emotionally involved, I think. Oh. Is this all my thoughts? As I say, I can see why people talk about this as if it's going to be a classic. I could see this being studied in schools. I could see people analysing what different sections of the text are doing and how we're looking at trauma. It's quite Dickensian, it's quite sad. There are moments of happiness in it, but it is largely a very bleak story, and there's some of Dickens that's quite bleak. There's some of Thomas Hardy that's quite bleak. You know, sometimes he does romantic stories and sometimes he does these really bleak, depressing stories. So yes, I could see it being studied and I could see it being a classic, but ultimately it is not the story for me. But I'm glad I've read it. Right, let's have a look at what else, because I read this because it was nominated for the Booker Prize in 2015. But as I said, this was actually also nominated, I think, in the Goodreads Choice Awards and the Women's Prize for Fiction in that year. Ysgrifennu y Cod. Brief History of Seven Killings was the winner in 2015. I have not read that. I haven't read any other books on the Booker Prize shortlist or long list other than this one. A Spool of Blue Thread, that was also nominated in the Women's Prize, and I do quite fancy that. I really fancy trying some Anne Tyler. But yeah, Satin Island, The Fishermen, The Year of the Runaways, Did You Ever Have a Family, The Green Road, The Illuminations, The Moore's Account, Lila, Sleeping on Jupiter, and The Chimes. And I've not read any of them, and I've not really heard about any of them either. But I'm quite pleased to have got 5 more books finished from my shelves. If I had to rank them in order, my favourite would have been The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin, without a doubt. Absolutely magnificent. I can't wait to read the next one. Then Grief is the Thing with Feathers. Really enjoyed that. I won't include The Wrath and the Dawn in this list because I didn't finish it, and I realised I'm really not the target audience for that. Now, which one would I place above The Bees or A Little Life? I think they might be neck and neck. They do very different things and they tell very different stories. The Bees, I think, is a more engaging story just to read if you wanted to sit down and have a fun time. A fun time is a dystopia, but if you just wanted a really engaging story, I would recommend The Bees. But I think A Little Life does something slightly more interesting if you can slog through how long it is. It is just that slight bit more thought-provoking, I think. So there we go. That's another one done. Thanks for watching.